if you've got athletic directors from the Southeastern Conference, if you've got a head coach there in Scott Frost, if you've got a head coach in Nick Saban saying that we want to play, then at some level, how are we not playing? So, it's all going to be very, very interesting. But right now we are joined by Frank Rossi. Frank, thanks so much for joining us. How are you today?
Russell, good in general, but obviously things are a little bit problematic here for our football world, and I hate seeing what's happening out there. And I would want to help break it down for everybody that's listening to understand how we did get here, because I think a lot's being missed in the sudden rush to judgment on what's going on in the D1 world. We've experienced it already in D3, as you know, Russell, and a lot of it is very similar in nature, just a few weeks removed now.
Yeah, and so let's go ahead and jump into that. Let's go ahead and jump in on that. As far as we are right now, it looks like the Big Ten, or there have been reports out that the Big Ten is shutting it down. There is obviously a feeling that if the Big Ten shuts down football, and it's not just going to be fall football, they're not going to play in the spring. So if they shut it down, they're done for this calendar year, for this school year. The Pac-12 is surely quick to follow that. Let's just start there. How did we get here?
So last week, the Board of Governors decision where they had enacted some mandates. But preceding that, the Pac-12 players that had united together, and then the Big Ten players that did the same right after that, had a list of demands that included things like protection of scholarships with the opt-out allowances, but also alongside that, the idea of not requiring liability waivers, and also a question of shifting costs to schools for any sports-related COVID infections that occurred. And, when it was just the Pac-12 and the Big Ten having discussions with players about these requirements, it was one thing. But somehow, between that happening and the Board of Governors meeting, which was supposed to be deciding more on fall championships than anything else, suddenly we got mandates that included testing guidelines became mandates. Weekly testing was a requirement. That you could weather as a Division I team, especially a Power 5 team. But then the things that really were the game changers were the liability waivers, that you couldn't mandate a player sign them to play, and also the cost shifting for whatever you could define as a sports-related COVID infection. You know as well as I do, if a player was in the general population of the student body and then went into practice and then played the sport, you trace for me how they got that infection. I can't, and the assumption would have to fall on, they got it from playing sport. Playing the sport would have to cough up the money for it. How do you ensure that in real terms, other than a self-insurance mechanism? Because an insurer would require, in this time that we're in, and I can tell you this as somebody who consults with rec leagues and flag football right now, let alone anything else, that the insurers want you to get the waivers signed so at least they have a leg to stand on when it comes to lawsuits later on. These schools can't hack it. So the Board of Governors made those decisions, Russell, and then fast forward a few days later when suddenly the discussion about the heart tissue inflammation possibilities came into the mix, and that's what caused the MAC to cancel this past weekend. A lot of people don't realize that even the flu causes those types of heart tissue inflammations. Go see the study from my school. I went to Harvard Law School, so I have a certain interest in Harvard studies that are done out there. Well, there's a Harvard study done in 2009 that explains that the flu causes that same kind of heart response ultimately. So there's a lot of overreaction, a lot of snap judgments being made, but the schools are scared because they can't weather this financial burden ultimately. They'll say it's about health, safety, and welfare. It's about their bottom line, health, safety, and welfare right now, not the players.
And so, and that is what happened. And I opened the show today saying this is about liability. This is not about health and welfare. This is not about saving lives. This is about liability. And so, at that point, it's been shown that the NCAA has once again screwed things up, because without the Board of Governors saying, without them overreacting to a group of players putting their name to something in the Pac-12, and threatening to not play. Now they've completely overreacted, and now we can't have COVID waivers. Is there any way that the NCAA could come back, and I know that they won't, but is there legally any way that they can go back and like retract the COVID waiver, the lack of COVID waiver mandate?
The folks that I speak with that work with the NCAA on committees such as selection committee, et cetera, in Division III, have been very careful to tell me that when we were dealing with the guidelines back when in the resocialization of sport document that they've been updating for the last few months, that they were extremely careful to call them guidelines, because in the past when they've resorted to calling something a requirement or a mandate, it's caused a legal issue or threshold for the NCAA by doing it. Once you put your name to a requirement as the NCAA, you are basically creating a legal liability problem for not just the organization, but the schools related to it. So can they go back? They could try to. Could I sue using this initial mandate and say, well, they were just coaxed out of the mandate basically by a bunch of players and schools? Yeah, I probably could sue using that and actually have a leg to stand on in a courtroom or, to a settlement if it came down to that. So they really did create a legal problem for themselves last week. I think we kind of discussed this last week when you and I had talked about Division III's reaction to it. Well, here it is in Division I land. And the one thing I want to say, Russell, is I think Trevor Lawrence is being 100% upright with the country right now with the things he's saying. The problem I'm seeing is that some of the same people, some of the same players that signed on to the Pac-12 and Big Ten movement that we saw are the folks that are in this whole we want to play movement that we're seeing today. And I need them to wake up to one thing. The requirements and the mandates that they were looking for, two of them in particular, got added on to this list and are part of the reason why we aren't going to play as it stands right now. They need to realize they may have had a hand in this themselves. And maybe those are the guys that have to stand up and say, we didn't really mean it. Maybe that's the pathway here to get the NCAA some cover to basically say, okay, we are going to change this because we did this for them. And now that they're saying they're okay otherwise, we can undo that.
Frank Rossi joins us. He is an attorney and also co-host of at D3 FB Huddle. Okay, so we're talking about, we mentioned before we had you on, that Scott Frost has said that we want to play football. We're going to play football. We would like to play in the Big Ten, but if that's not possible, we will look at all other avenues. The question I would have is this, and this came up today at lunch. If, in fact, Nebraska, Iowa were to say, or even Ohio State were to say, but I won't use Ohio State because they're such a big player, but Nebraska or Iowa in the Big Ten, if they choose to play Big 12 or SEC football, do they kind of endanger themselves of being removed from the Big Ten? And where would grant and rights go going forward? Because I think most of these TV packages are written through like 2035. Could they potentially be looking at being kicked out of a conference and losing that television revenue going forward?
I want to say, first off, that Frost statement, and my co-host James Baker and I were talking about this before I came on. He's down in Orlando, Florida, so he sees the UCF things more than I do down there. And he said to me flat out, Frost never said things like this when he was at UCF. He was a lot more careful than this. So I will tell you flat out that Frost is not saying this on his own volition. An AD and or president of Nebraska signed off on him saying something to that degree. I saw it, read it, see if he had run it on Twitter, and I was a little bit shocked, too, to hear him say it. But I actually proud of him, too, because, look, it takes some you-know-what to stand up there and say something like that in the face of a Big Ten cancellation. I think we're seeing a lot of posturing. I do not think we've had a final vote yet, Russell, in the Big Ten. In fact, we've heard people claim just that it's not going to happen until at least 6 o'clock tonight, Eastern time. And so I think there's posturing going on. The Jim Harbaughs and the Frosts are basically saying to this conference, don't make this decision. Avoid this decision. Look at the players right now. Do they run the risk if they do go out to another conference this is something that we were facing actually in Division III too, this very question. Could teams go to another conference if their conference has canceled it? And generally what the conferences were saying were, yes, you can do what you need to do ultimately to play the game of football this year. We get it. But we don't have the multi-million-dollar contracts involved that Division I does, especially in FBS. And so I don't know the answer to that question because it's probably buried deep inside some conference document that had all these what-if scenarios that we never ever had to consider before in it, because the lawyers probably planned on something where somebody may break off and try to play in another conference despite the fact they don't have the permission to do it. I think it really comes down to conferences doing the right thing and saying to their members, if we don't play as a conference, you go do what you've got to do ultimately this year. But that also hurts their chances of any spring play. If you're the Big Ten, you're saying no spring play anyway, well, then it doesn't really matter this year, does it? And so a lot of posturing and hopefully some good resolutions come from this ultimately for the schools that do want to play.
So basically, these major programs are holding basically a gun to the conference's heads and saying, "Don't do this. You're going to regret this." Something that MK brought up earlier today, the segment before we had you on, and she said, "Well, what about transfers?" Because I think that if in fact, say Nebraska, for example, doesn't play, because the Big Ten says we can't play. Well, if the SEC, the Big 12, and the ACC are playing, you're going to see a mass exodus of players. And I kind of feel like the NCAA is going to have no choice but to approve those measures. Is this a reason for the different conferences to kind of drag their feet so that the players don't get in before practice starts?
Well, let's face it. At least in Division III today started the preseason. Technically, the reapproved date for preseason start was August 10th. We're sitting in it. And so I don't believe Division I was much different because they had an earlier start to their season anyway. So we're probably inside the actual start of the season for schools right now, at least on paper. So do I think that we're going to see a kick the can approach today or tonight by the Big Ten? I kind of do, for the reason you're suggesting. But I'm also going to suggest the following to you. I don't think they can get these transfers to occur without extraordinary relief, not just a waiver, but an extraordinary waiver by the NCAA. Never have we allowed players before to transfer while in the actual mix of a season. And we're there right now. We are actually in the mix of the season making these decisions right now. It would take some really tough decision-making by the NCAA to allow the floodgates open. I listened to your past segment, and Mary Kay was spot on about the question, but the question that comes back is, how can they allow this, and how can it be anybody but seniors doing it, because once you're gone, you're gone.
Well, and that was a big thing, and that was kind of when you listen to the segment, that's kind of what I was wondering about, because again, if you're talking about a Wisconsin, they get a 5-star every once in a while, they get some 4 stars, but mainly their roster is made up of 3 stars. If some of these kids start bailing, then you could basically have a COVID mandated death penalty for all intents and purposes.
And that's why I don't think the NCAA just out of hand signs off on a waiver like that, and they will use the cover of too late, guys. It's just too late to do it. Sorry. But you got the opt-out this season, and you've got your eligibility remaining, and your scholarship's going to be intact. So there's your consolation prize. Go be a student as a student athlete right now in the classroom, and we'll talk to you next year when you take the field for your team next fall.
Okay, one last thing really quickly. Do you think that if in fact the Big Ten does make this decision, do you think it alters things largely and a lot of these guys take the opt-out year, transfer, this is their transfer year, and go somewhere else because the SEC has their players' backs, the ACC has their players' backs, the Big 12 has their players' backs, and the Big Ten really doesn't care about us wanting to play?
I think it does happen. I do. But in the same realm of what we thought in Division III, the question came up about whether or not we see this uptick in graduate situations playing football in future years. And the answer was, unless you really have a future in football, no, because you've got to go take your future in business eventually and go get your career going. not everybody that's playing Division I FBS football is going to be drafted, and they know that. Not everybody's going to continue their career. So will the 5 stars and the 4 stars maybe transfer that can't get drafted right away or need a better to draft position? Yeah, maybe they will. Absolutely. It won't be 0, but it won't be 100% either, if you get what I'm saying. It's going to be something probably in a lower realm of this, but it's enough to make some dents in some programs up north and actually help the programs down south for the next 3 to 5 years, make some inroads that you'll never see the national championship move back up north in terms of who wins it for a little while.
He is Frank Rossi. Catch him at D3FB Huddle on Twitter. Also a contributor to D3Football.com, attorney in the state of New York. Frank, I really enjoyed our conversation last night, and I enjoyed the one here today. There was less violent outbursts by me in this one, but I really appreciate the time.
Russell, always a pleasure. And they were violent outbursts. I think they were called rational under the circumstances we're all facing right now. Let's hope the Big Ten does the right thing tonight.
Absolutely, Frank. Thanks so much, man. We'll be in touch soon.
You got it.
Frank Rossi, again, from D3FB Huddle on Twitter and at D3Football.com. We'll get a break here, come back at 4 o'clock. Larry Blakeney's going to join us here on the Fallout Sports Radio 740.